Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this session on working with pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. My name is Vijita Patel and I'm the principal of Swiss Cottage School Development and Research Center. Before we begin, just a huge thank you for embarking on teacher training and joining the profession. The role that you play for an inclusive society is pivotal, and we admire each of you for thinking deeply about the role that you'll play in growing inclusive citizens for our local community. Today's session is going to focus on how to consider the bigger picture for pupils with SEN and disabilities, those with additional needs. And what we're going to do is structure this into 3 sections. So over the next roughly 30 to 35 minutes, we're going to just have an overview around the national context, have a think about provision, and then explore some key threads you can hold on to for pedagogy. So to start us off, there are roughly 8.7 million pupils in the country. I'm just going to ask you a few questions to think about. How many of those pupils do you think are identified with a special educational need and/or disability? How many of the 8.669 million do you think have a identified SEN or disability? Then as you're considering that, how many of those pupils do you think are attending a special needs school like Swiss Cottage or are in mainstream? And then finally, for those of you who may know about an education, health, and care plan, how many of the pupils identified with an SEN do you feel have the golden ticket of the education, health, and care plan? So let's look at those numbers now. 1.24 million identified with special educational needs and disabilities nationally. Of the 1.24 million, only 242,185 had an education, health, and care plan in the year of this data drop from the National Office of Statistics. Of the 1.24 million, the number that are in special schools sits at a little under 108,000. That includes all special schools, independent, charity-run, state-maintained like Swiss. So as you can see, the majority of pupils are sitting in mainstream schools. And what's incredibly important in this picture is the majority do not have the education healthcare plan, which is an important document that is the outcome of a very sort of detailed assessment process. So the knowledge and understanding on what that provision needs to be for the majority of pupils without an EHCP, that 81%, comes through systems and processes within schools and the relationship that has with multi-agency professionals. Those figures are not to overwhelm you or make you nervous, but what's really important is just know factually that in every class that you will be in, there will be a child either identified formally with the special educational need or disability, or potentially with an invisible SEN that has not gone through a formal assessment process yet. So in many ways, what's helpful for us to think about is the world of special needs and disabilities, not as a hierarchy, but one where actually quite a few pupils will have layered needs. Some of those may not be formally diagnosed, but knowledge and understanding around what that profile may be and supportive ways of engaging that child or young person in the journey of learning support us as teachers and educators in meeting them at their point of learning, thinking about what's going to support them with that next step, and crucially ensuring they're meeting their fullest potential, because our role together is to ensure that we are breaking down barriers to engagement so that we're equipping them to be owners of their role in the local community and as they transition into their pathways for adulthood. There are 4 national designations for special educational needs and disability. So communication and interaction, cognition and learning, sensory or physical needs, and social, emotional, and mental health needs. Giving you some examples of what those special educational needs are as labels within the 4 categories. The categories are intentionally broad areas of need. So we've had a new form of legislation, and what the legislation has done is moved in the direction of broad areas of need, the 4 broad areas of need, so that school provision, pedagogy, and curriculum design can really think about these children and young people amongst the majority of their peers. What's important to consider is that the pupils in your class are very much going to reflect this new generation of children who don't fit very neatly into categories. Professor Barry Carpenter is an authority internationally, and his publications are highly recommended by me because they're very accessible, engaging, and actually go to the heart of us moving past the label and more into the consideration about what will work for the broader sense of a profile of pupil, because it's very unusual now to have pupils fit neatly into sort of quite formal designations of SEN. So as we think about that national picture and those numbers, over the last 7 years, there's been significant developments across our sort of policy and legislation picture as educators in schools. Changes with the national curriculum, which approaches to assessment, a lot of changes that have taken place with accreditations. And each of these has a significant impact on the considerations for pupils with additional needs. You're joining your training year on a fantastic year because actually many of those changes have now settled. So the confidence with the 4 broad areas of need is more settled. There's a greater understanding or common language on what to consider across the 4 areas instead of just the individual types of special needs. Alongside that is a greater sort of momentum in the system to personalize curriculum, to think about what character we're developing in the children and young people in our schools. And that is because of a number of the changes that have come through the primary and then secondary curriculum. The challenge that we face as educators is the way that speaks to the formal assessment processes and the accreditation processes as well. The key legislation that each of us wants to be aware of is the SEN Code of Practice, so the Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice. This is not a new legislation. It was reviewed and has essentially a version 2 after the former version, which was in the system for over 25 years. Most crucially, what we need to know from it is that it is thinking about the aspirational outcomes for children and young people with SEND. It very much puts an emphasis on the responsibility for these children and young people to be held and shared jointly. There's a shared responsibility for this population of pupils. And as you can see on the screen, every teacher is a teacher of SEN and disabilities. Schools that you may have been in will have departments for inclusion. They may have a specialist teacher or a specialist learning assistant. There will be a SENCO, and there'll be a number of roles wrapped around a lot of the considerations for pupils with this population. But fundamentally in this legislation is a commitment to ensuring that the best way to meet the needs for pupils with SEN and disabilities is through quality first teaching. And my recommendation to you at this point would be to just Google that, quality first teaching. If you're on Twitter or social media, there's so many, I guess, education influencers sitting on Twitter. And it's great to see what they share so openly through their blogs and their websites for quality first teaching, because actually, There are dilemmas that can sit here on what teaching and learning should look like. What the policy and legislation does is ensure that we as educators have space to really personalize our approaches, but that we're not alone in doing that. It's very much about that collaborative effort. So I mentioned that I'm from Swiss Cottage School. Our school is a special needs school. We have the most complex population of learners in our locality of Camden. We also have 14 to 15 other local authorities represented in our school. There's a number of mainstream primary and secondary schools in our area. The most important and crucial priority for us as a school is that we're not seen as an island. We very much want to be a part of the whole, because if we're preparing our children and young people to be a part of the locality, they really need to know their peer groups and their primary and secondary counterparts. We're a school for children aged 2 to 19. If a child comes to our school at the age of 2, that is quite a predestination at such a young age to be in a special needs setting. So what we want to make sure also is that pupils in mainstream primaries and then mainstream secondaries have a sense of the pupils in this school. It's a two-way process and a two-way relationship. So when we're thinking about working with children with special educational needs and/or disabilities, don't think about it just as your class or your school. Actually think about the connections that could be made with your local special needs school so that you're able to develop a acceptance of pupils that may sort of present with different sort of personalities, communicate in different ways, exhibit different behaviors, because it helps us move society past the tolerance of difference to the acceptance, the appreciation, and the value. Our school is also a national teaching school. We have a number of mainstream trainee teachers coming through our schools every year. If anybody in this session would like to, in this post-COVID reality, do some observations or interact with our school, please feel free to use the email address and the website at the end, or to let Ben know so that we can organize that for you. We are partners with UCL-IOE. So first part was that national picture. So we went through kind of the statistics, the legislation, that common language on the 4 broad areas of need, your knowledge that there is a SEND code of practice. And then the second part now is provision. So when we think about provision in school design, this is my main emphasis to you. One size does not fit all. So even if you took 2 special schools, they will not have the same curriculum design, because we're always considering how we personalize the provision to the population of pupils in our schools. The same stands for secondary schools. Although there might be an endpoint of GCSE and A levels, accreditations that may be around functional skills, the curriculum and what you want to develop for the children in your class is something that enriches and makes schools incredibly exciting and innovative locations. So this old model of a school system, which is a bit of a conveyor belt, very much churning out those children, that is a thing of the past. I mean, over the last 5 to 7 years, there's been such momentum to grow amazing and creative classroom environments, curriculum redesign. And that's been led very much from the front line, from teachers themselves saying, you know what, this is a digital age. It does not make sense for us to remain in archaic models. And it's quite exciting. What we want to bear in mind in that process is the pupils with additional needs. Now, if pupils are driving that curriculum redesign at classroom level, the knowledge around the children and young people is fundamental. If we think about this population of pupils with SEN and disabilities, you as secondary trainees, when you're on your placements, just pose you the challenge to explore whether the class teacher or the department that you are working with has interacted with the primary file for the pupils that might be on an SEN register. And if they've interacted with the primary school file for pupils that don't necessarily have a formal assessment sitting on them, but are starting to pose maybe priorities, or in some schools, challenges that are trying to be problem solved. because actually we can go into frontline problem solving very quickly, but doing that little bit of research on what the primary schools have understood and developed around that child or young person can be the fundamental piece of the puzzle on what themes we may want to integrate into a curriculum to support their engagement, which builds their confidence into your teaching and learning approaches to support their progress. The label of SEN can be quite useful in some circumstances. A lot of families fight really hard to get that education, health, and care plan or that assessment that does confirm for them that their child needs additional considerations. But it can equally become a label that is burdensome. There is an SEN register in every single school. It sits with your managed information system. That could be, for example, a SIM system. There's so many types now that sort of exist in our schools. The key thing to remember is the SEN register is kind of giving you a yes or no of the pupils that have that sort of label sitting on them. What we do with it is the exciting bit of the puzzle. And as secondary school teachers, what's important to know is that for that child or young person who has come from a primary school model where there is one or two teachers, some specialist teachers, but a big wraparound approach to their classroom and provision, they're now having to navigate a number of different teaching styles from different subject specialists. They're having to navigate really complex timetables that are demanding and are going to challenge them to think about where they need to be, how to be there on time, what they're going to need and be required to do. And that is a lot to navigate. What we do for pupils with complex needs or special educational needs and disabilities is equally valuable for pupils who may not have any of those labels. So when you take a step back and ask yourself those questions on what is this child having to navigate, what are we doing to coordinate as a group of teachers so that we're able to really step into their shoes and see what their experience is? It's quite interesting to think about that for pupils who may not have additional needs, because naturally there are some opportunities that are going to surface that are going to support us to be able to support them. And anything we do is going to be in the position of supporting them to succeed. The challenge here is that each of these subjects will have different demands. Their frequency will vary by week 1 or week 2 timetables. And the requirements of each subject, whether it's something that's very hands-on, something that's requiring holding on to former knowledge, the ability to have particular communication styles, their ability to navigate group work or independent work, the way that the child is going to be able to actually switch and move from activity to activity. Those are all aspects that can be quite complex, straightforward, or challenging. And what we need to do is bear in mind that we don't want a repetitive cycle that might remove the self-confidence or reduce their sense of self if they're finding it challenging. What we need to do is unpick how we can boost their sense of self by giving them those small steps of celebratory wins that helps them feel like they're going to be able to navigate this picture smoothly and as quickly as possible in that transition period. For children in Key Stage 4, there are equal complexities that have to do with the way that schools might be modeled with accreditations. What's important for us to think about in this session is the way that we as a group of teachers are able to coordinate with the SEN coordinator, the SENCO, or the inclusion lead, and often the pastoral lead, to make sure those pupils are not remaining invisible, but actually are at the heart of our considerations. So from there, that gives us the perfect entryway into pedagogy. This is, the approaches to teaching, what we're considering to be able to support children and young people who have special educational needs and/or disabilities. So as you can see, there's no text. That is because there is no playbook for this part of the presentation. There's no golden wand. There's no right way or particular way to teach children with special educational needs and/or disabilities. At the end of the day, they are still young people in your classroom. Our knowledge and understanding of what their needs are, what their strengths are, will inform what we do to support them. There are approaches that you can put into place that allow you to support them in that engagement process, but there is not a quick win, and there's not a straightforward answer sheet. And that's the most important takeaway from this session. What builds up over time is being able to know what you find quite creative and effective based off of your subject and based off of the sort of class dynamic, if that's a way to say it. When you're embarking on your placements and your action research, it's very interesting to think about pedagogy in terms of pupils with additional needs and those that may not have any particular categories or labeling wrapped around them. Because the question I often ask trainee teachers is, there might be subtle changes towards differentiation or strategies to support children and young people in being able to really access the learning opportunity. But that climate for learning that you're creating, that climate that makes it interesting, that makes it exciting, that makes it possible, that makes the children and young people feel like this is something I want to engage with. I have an interest here. And that's because the climate is really motivating me to engage with the challenge of the learning. That's the fundamental piece. And that's important for any young person in your class. So we want to start off by saying the most important thing we emphasize at our school is that every teacher is the leader of their classroom. We challenge all of our teachers to have a vision for their class. They're working with quite a wide spectrum of special educational needs and disabilities. They could be line managing teaching assistants, which creates other challenges with expectation, holding to account, clarity of planning. But fundamentally, if we can get the vision right, what are the great aims that we have for this group of pupils? How are we going to motivate them to engage with learning? How do we build up their sense of self and motivate them to want to take those risks? How do we develop those behaviors of learning? That's the interesting side for pedagogy. And at our school, you will not see two classrooms that are the same. And you also will very rarely see teachers with the same teaching styles. That's because they've challenged themselves to engage with research, to really unpack what pedagogy is, but what it could be as well. So progress is often seen as the cognitive side. But actually, if we're developing the characteristics of our children and young people, we want to look at the holistic picture, how to develop their emotional, social, and behavioral aspects as well. Because if we're going to develop their ability to be able to meet their fullest potential, the exciting part is how we're able to redesign the curriculum at classroom level to be able to integrate all of this for that climate of learning. So in many ways, the fundamental piece is the process that is not always seen, but often the assessment measures will be looking at the hard data. But each of those small steps of success for a child or young person in your class, if they have additional needs, is so pivotal. It's so fundamental for the bigger picture of who we're developing in them. We want them to feel visible. We want them to feel confident. We're trying to develop children and young people who are going to be able to manage change, who are going to be able to really navigate very carefully disappointments, how they're going to be able to handle challenges in social scenarios. That entire process of just being a teenager is so complex. Can you imagine what that is with an additional need? What we want to do is ensure that when we think about that behavior, emotional, and social side of their development, if we can put the focus on that, the cognitive will follow as well, because we're automatically developing all of those crucial aspects that define who they are. And these are children and young people who are missing their sort of expectations for their peers. Oftentimes, SEN is associated with deficits. Can you imagine if by the time you're 11, most of what you're heard or have seen on reports is, this child cannot do this. They have not met this objective. They still cannot meet this for this level. What is that going to do for self-esteem? What will that do for that sense of them as a student? And what does that give them as a sense of who they'll be in their local community and as a citizen in their society? What we need to do is flip that narrative, focus on the small steps that they can succeed at so that they can take pride and build up their confidence on what they're achieving. And that comes down to you, because the reality is this is an accountability system. Ofsted exists, we have GCSEs, we have A-levels, and all those accreditations. But their sense of what they've achieved comes from that climate of learning, that cheer they get from their peers and one another because of what you're doing in your classroom environment to help them see who they are and maximize their potential. And that is priceless. So it sits in the category of pedagogy for me, because if you can get that in your teaching and learning, you've got passion for your subject. You're sitting in this course because you're really excited about shaping future citizens. Helping pupils see one another and helping them accept each other is a fundamental piece of that process. Oftentimes, assessment data is what is provided for considerations. Then there could be pastoral data. So you might get assessment data on me as a pupil. I might have autism. I might have an oppositional defiance disorder and a communication disorder. So I'm pretty sure my assessment data isn't going to look so great. My pastoral data, because you know what, I didn't really want to come to school last year that much because all I heard about was what I wasn't doing right. Got loads of attendance gaps. My family are struggling with me a bit, so I'm with social services, and then my SEN profile is there. I mean, that is a challenging picture to be working with. So the question is, what could support you if I was in your class? You start off the year and there she is. You've got this pupil and you've got all this data that's almost giving a red flag. I would say the greatest information you could have is what you get for yourself. So those are important pieces of the puzzle. It's already telling me that I have a child or young person. The student Vijita is someone who is finding it hard to engage. She's also had a summer holiday. We've had the pandemic and the lockdown. Things may have broken down a bit at home. She's got a social worker attached to her. Oppositional defiance disorder, before I even Google it, is telling me a lot as a word. The autism side of it, okay, I've got a lot to interact with here. But the more useful part of that is probably going to be what we can glean for ourselves. What do I do in terms of my planning? Where do I sit on the spectrum for how much working memory I can interact with? How do I manage with problem solving? You know, with all of that that's on my profile, actually my verbal reasoning might be amazing, because the one thing I've learned is work avoidance, and I can negotiate very, very well. Mental flexibility, do I have the tolerance or the patience for that? And task switching. These are key components that we can work with. The information over here is important, but it's not the only information we need. So in this introduction to how to work with children and young people with SEN, my most important sort of message to you is there's the information you get, but there's the information that you can create. And that is often the gold dust. That is what's going to help you develop a relationship with me as a pupil. I'm going to get a sense that there's not a judgment, but there's actually an interest in trying to understand what I can do versus what I can't. And actually, all 6 of those components have everything to do with what you're going to embark on for a scheme of work, what you're going to want to do with your planning, what you're going to want to do to decide who I sit with. Am I a person who will be better at working independently? Might I be better placed with a pupil who's very strong with their task switching, because then actually they're getting peer support? If I am really good at verbal reasoning, do I naturally want to building a sort of starter activity that is promoting some of that verbal interaction, because it's going to allow me to feel hooked? These are the things that we're trying to understand. What are the motivators? What's going to help us engage so that we can meet the child or young person at their point of learning? Those 6 components that I just gave you are known as executive function. Executive function is, there's so much research out there. You could very easily Google it. You could go to your inclusion department and they should be able to give you information on those 6 categories as well. And the important thing to know is actually there's a piece of research that has actually come out of UCL-IOE that was done by a group of master's students where they assessed different special educational needs and where the 6 components could be a strength or a deficit. So it's quite interesting to think that actually for particular special educational needs, some of these components could be a strength, because that automatically helps you think about what you want to focus on to engage them. Where it's a deficit, it's not lifelong. This is what we can develop. So if we structure our lessons correctly, if we take the time to do some observations or actually get the child themselves involved in that audit process, we're going to have so much information for an academic year that is actually anchored in the best type of baseline, a baseline that helps the child or young person think about their own sort of state of play with each of these 6 areas. The thing that I would pose to us is, why aren't we auditing this for the whole class? It's actually very straightforward. You take a few lessons, you plan some of your star lessons based off of some of these components, depending on your subject area. And all it's giving you is a baseline between 1 and 5 in each of these areas. And actually, when a child self-assesses against that, it's giving you really good information on whether they've got an accurate sense of where they sit when you've got the formative assessment sitting there as well. It's priceless. So this is fundamental in this picture around pedagogy. And in this introductory session, and I'm sure there'll be more, so you're going to go deep dive into various areas around supporting pupils with additional needs. In today's introductory session, I think what's really important is to know that when we think about that national picture, we then think about that policy and legislation, the fact that curriculum is what we want it to be. We also have great consideration around how we're able to control what we are using as the important data to inform what we will do as teachers. So social emotional aspects of learning. I've spoken a lot about how we're building up self-confidence, sense of self, how we want to motivate the children and young people to engage. You know, those social and emotional aspects of learning are pivotal in any subject. They give us a golden thread as teachers across a week 1 and week 2 timetable. Alongside that, which is really useful to interact with, is the concept of metacognition. So metacognition is basically the process of, processing information, thinking. There's a lot on Twitter, on social media, and on various blogs by those education influencers. If you look up metacognition and quality first teaching, if you look up social and emotional aspects of learning and quality first teaching, and if you were to look up special educational needs and quality first teaching, So my takeaway for you would be, you don't have to create anything brand new. You don't have to try to unpick this on your own. A lot of us have been trying to learn this over time. But the most important piece of the puzzle is your awareness that these are the important components when working with children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. But in my opinion, it's when you're working with any teenager. All we need to do is reflect to how we felt in high school or secondary school. These are really important components when you think about what's impacting children and young people with puberty, with the reality of COVID-19 and the pandemic, with the role of this digital world and social media, and what we want to do, not to teach them what they should know, but to put them in the driving seat of learning. That works for all children and young people, but it's fundamental for those with additional needs because we want to equip them to be advocates for themselves. We want to help them have a voice in how they're able to say what they need, what they know, and what they want. Because often that can become quite an invisible message from them if they're constantly being told what they cannot do. So very crucially, there's so many networks of teachers that are working together in your own school as you embark on this training year. It'd be interesting to see what you found worked the best with Senkos and inclusion leaders alongside department leads and class teachers. Some work very, very effectively. Others don't. Both give you so much information for when you're going to enter your NQT year, because those that work really, really well give you a model of best practice. It's what you want to aspire to be a part of as a team. Those where you find that sometimes there could be silos or there's not a lot of connectivity, it really lets you think about, well, as a teacher, I am still responsible for every teacher would send. So how am I going to advocate for that? How am I going to push for more connectivity where it's needed? That's a great action research project as well. You're at the start of your training year. There's not a right or wrong way for things to happen. We work with a number of secondary schools, and I must say I find it incredibly inspiring to see how no two schools work the same way. Where there is a culture and a value system that is inclusive, then you just see incredibly creative and exciting ideas for how to make a school community feel like one. And at the heart of that is this entire push for nurturing and maximizing the potential of these young people, ensuring that they're not invisible in their school community helps them feel very visible in their local community. I'm going to end by just throwing it in that the pandemic has compounded some of the challenges for pupils with SEN and disabilities, and compounded them in the ways that could create future barriers. We're all locking down, we're becoming protective bubbles. There's a lot of vulnerabilities associated, could be medical, could be mental health, the social and emotional aspects as well. What we need to be aware of as teachers is oftentimes the signs of where there are concerns are going to be in our classrooms, even more so now than before, because actually society is closing in order to protect itself with COVID-19. So my final thought for you is there is never a wrong question. And if you observe something and it's just hitting that question mark for you where you don't know the answer, something doesn't feel quite right, or there just might be a curiosity for you on why that is the way a child may be presenting themselves, how they may be closing in, or actually, you know, their profile's changing, never hesitate to get in touch with another teacher, to liaise with your SEN coordinator, your Senko, or the inclusion lead, and make sure that it's followed up as well. Because right now, the circumstances that are hitting our local community are so challenging. The role of us as teachers in being able to be quite crucially that sort of support system and mechanism for support is quite pivotal. So as we come to the end of this session, just a quick reminder that we are Swiss Cottage School Development and Research Center. Our virtual doors are always open to you. We are on Twitter, so it's an easy way to ask us questions after this session as well. My Twitter handle's at the top of the session, and please know that we very much want to support you during your journey. And thank you so much for engaging in a session that has core values that are pushing for a very inclusive society and the role that you play in that. We really deeply appreciate what you're doing. Good luck with the rest of your journey, and we hope to hear from some of you soon. Thank you.